Welcome to Create More Intimacy, a podcast for men. I'm Elisa Stoddard, and I help successful men stop chasing sex and start building real connection so they finally feel close, connected, and wanted again. A lot of men that I work with can tell me exactly what their wife has asked for. They've had long conversations about it. They listen, they nod along, and they said that they understand. And then, if we're being honest, very little actually changes. Or it changed for a week or two, or a month or something, or just long enough to feel like they were trying. This is where something important gets missed. Safety in a relationship doesn't come from talking about change. It comes from seeing it consistently over time. When a woman shares what she needs and nothing really shifts, she doesn't feel heard and she feels exposed, and eventually she stops believing that opening up will lead anywhere. So when you do start trying again and it feels like she doesn't trust it or criticizes instead of relaxes, that isn't because the effort you're putting in doesn't matter. It's because history matters. From her side, brief changes feel like lip service. And from your side, it feels discouraging to keep trying when it's not acknowledged, it's not received very well. That tension is real. And it's exactly where many couples get stuck. So the question isn't, have we talked about this enough? The question is, what have I actually changed? And has that change lasted long enough for her to feel safe? Welcome to episode 42. You tried to step up. Why did it make things worse? Here's where a lot of men misunderstand what's happening. They think the problem is that their effort isn't being appreciated. But what's actually happening is the inconsistency makes effort feel unreliable. From her side, repeated conversations, followed by short-lived change, teach her something very specific. That talking doesn't lead to safety. That hoping costs way too much. That relaxing is risky. So when you start again, even sincerely, she doesn't meet you with relief. She meets you with caution. And this is often where men feel really blindsided. They'll say, I listened, or I really tried, or I really meant it this time. And all of that can be true. But intention does not repair trust. Patterns do. If your behavior shifts briefly and then fades, what she experiences isn't the effort that you put in. It feels like whiplash. It reinforces the idea that she cannot count on what she sees today lasting into next week. That's why visible, sustained change matters more than heartfelt conversations with nothing to back it up. And it's also why many men give up right here. They decide, well, I guess nothing I do is enough, or why bother if it's never right, or I tried and it didn't work. But stepping back confirms the very fear that's already there. This moment is uncomfortable because it requires something different than before. Not more talking, not bigger, grander gestures, not proving anything. It requires staying engaged after the initial motivation wears off. And that's the part that most men underestimate. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about what this conversation is and what it isn't. This isn't an episode about fixing your marriage in one listen. It's not about a checklist. And it is not about a set of techniques to try before the next fight. This is about seeing a pattern really clearly. Because when you don't understand why something keeps happening, you either push harder or you give up. And neither one of those actually changes anything. So as you listen, resist the urge to solve. You don't need to agree with everything that I say, and you don't even need to like it. Just notice what feels familiar and what makes you uncomfortable enough to want to look away. That is usually where the truth is. As you're listening right now, notice what's happening internally. Are you nodding along thinking, yeah, that's exactly it? Are you feeling defensive? Like parts of this just simply don't apply to you? Or are you quietly realizing there's a gap between what you meant to change and what actually changed? You don't need to answer anything yet, just notice. Because the men who get the most out of this work aren't the ones who try the hardest in the moment. They're the ones who are willing to be honest with themselves before they decide what comes next. Most men don't feel resistant at this stage. They feel uncertain. They're watching themselves more closely than before, second-guessing their timing, wondering if they're saying the right thing or doing too much or not enough. And that uncertainty is uncomfortable because for a long time you knew what your role was. Provide, handle things, be dependable, solve problems. And that identity made a lot of sense. And now you're being asked to show up differently without clear markers for success. There is no checklist for emotional presence. No confirmation that, yes, you indeed are doing it right. And no guarantee that your effort will be met with relief instead of a critique. So a lot of men hover here. They're trying, but cautiously. They're engaged, but tentatively. They want reassurance that this matters before they fully commit to changing how they show up. And I'll acknowledge this is also where frustration quietly builds. And I don't see it as like the explosive kind. It's the quieter kind that sounds like, well, I'm paying attention. What else do you want? I'm making an effort. Can't you see that? I don't want to mess this up. So maybe I should just back off. None of this makes you uncaring. It means you're in unfamiliar territory without a map and without immediate feedback. This is where many men mistake the discomfort they feel for failure. They assume that if it feels this awkward, that they must be doing something wrong, or that this level of effort isn't sustainable, or maybe they've misunderstood what was being asked of them in the first place. But this discomfort is part of that transition. It's what it feels like to move from doing what you were told to taking ownership without being directed. That shift away feels destabilizing before it will ever feel solid. Here is a subtle misunderstanding that trips up a lot of men. When a conversation feels deep and connected and clarifying, it creates this sense of relief and things feel calmer. The tension drops away and you walk away believing that something important shifted. And in a way, it has. Emotionally, you feel closer. Cognitively, you feel clearer. You believe that you've crossed a line that matters a lot. The problem is that emotional clarity doesn't automatically translate into changed behavior. Most men overestimate how much that insight is actually changing their habits. They assume that once something made sense in their brain, it will naturally show up differently in how they act. But patterns that took years to form don't just unwind themselves because they were named. And from her side, those conversations often come with hope. She's sharing something that matters a lot to her, sometimes for the 10th time, sometimes in a new way. And when daily life resumes and nothing reliably shifts, the message she absorbs isn't about your effort. It's about the lack of predictability, and she learns what to expect, and eventually, she adjusts herself accordingly. This is why talking can feel very productive while the relationship doesn't change that much. The conversation creates a moment of connection, but without sustained behavioral change. And that moment doesn't become a new pattern. And when this happens repeatedly, words just start carrying less weight. She doesn't believe what you say. Not because your words are insincere, but it's because they're not anchored in something that lasts. So the issue isn't whether communication happened, it's whether anything became different enough, consistent enough to change what she expects next time. This is one of the hardest dynamics for men to recognize while they're inside of it. Most men don't experience themselves as inconsistent. They experience themselves as responsive and lean in when things feel tense, and they make changes after difficult conversations. They show up when the cost of not doing so feels really high. And because the effort is genuine in these moments, it can feel confusing when it doesn't seem to count later. What often goes unseen is how change is experienced over time. When behavior shifts only under pressure, it teaches something unintended. That engagement is temporary, that it arrives with urgency and leaves when things settle down. Instead of creating reassurance, this pattern creates vigilance in her. Here's often what happens next, and without anybody naming it, after a while, the effort starts to feel heavy. I know it's not because you don't care, and I know it's not because you're unwilling, but because you're not seeing the return that you hoped for the actions and the effort you're putting in. You did lean in, you stayed engaged, and you tried to become more present, and still it feels tense. So discouragement sets in. It doesn't show up as anger at first. It shows up more as logic. You start telling yourself, well, maybe I'm expecting too much from this. Or maybe I should stop trying to do this perfectly. Maybe it's better to stay in my lane and avoid making worse. In the moment, those thoughts feel very reasonable and even mature. But over time, they create distance. Without meaning to, you have just pulled back emotionally, and you became more careful, less expressive. You wait to be invited in again instead of stepping forward. And this is all because withdrawal is quiet and it's easy to miss. From the inside, it feels like self-protection, and from the outside, it feels like confirmation of what she already fears, that change will only last until it becomes a fight again. This is one of the most painful loops couples fall into. You get discouraged because your effort doesn't seem to land. She gets discouraged because your engagement doesn't hold. It doesn't last. And neither of you is trying to hurt the other. You're just reacting to the same pattern from different sides. The hard part here is that discouragement often shows up right when consistency matters the most. Not necessarily during the crisis and not during the conversation that occurred after, but after the fact, when nothing is on fire and staying engaged requires intention instead of urgency. She doesn't relax into what's different. She watches it. She waits to see if it holds. And when it doesn't, she adjusts herself rather than trusting the change. And a lot of men misread what's happening here. They assume that the issue is the lack of appreciation. But what's actually missing is steadiness. Steadiness is what allows trust to rebuild. It's what makes closeness feel possible again. When change comes and goes, it doesn't register as progress. It really just feels uncertain. And uncertainty is what keeps both people braced, even when the intention is good. If you strip this whole conversation down to its simplest form, it comes back to one question. What has actually changed? What has actually changed? Not what you intended to change, not what you talked about changing, not what you did when things felt tense or uncertain. What has become different in how you show up, even when nothing is wrong? A lot of men don't think about change this way. They think of it in terms of a response. They change when there's conflict, when there's pressure, when the cost of staying the same feels really high. Then things calm down, and without deciding anything consciously, the old patterns return. That isn't failure, it's just reverting back to old habits. But it does create a cycle that you should be really honest about. Change that only lasts until the next fight doesn't create trust. It might create temporary relief, but it's not enough. Lasting change looks a lot quieter than most men expect. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't come with immediate payoff. It shows up in the ordinary moments of regular old Tuesday, when there's no urgency pushing you and no conversations reminding you of what you said would happen. That's where consistency lives. So the real self-check isn't, did I try hard enough when things were bad? It's, what would still be true about how I showed up if nothing blew up this month? And if the honest answer is, well, not much, that doesn't mean you're hopeless or behind. It just means you've identified where real change actually needs to happen. Because growth isn't about reacting better next time. It's about becoming someone who doesn't need a crisis to stay engaged. Take care. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being here. If something in this episode hit home, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps more men find the support they need. And if you are ready to get help or take the next step, you'll find the link to book a free call in the show notes. I'll see you next time.